please give a warm welcome to Amanda.
Thank you. I have been up for many, many hours having flown across from Sydney, but I am very excited to be here talking to you all about coalitions, community, equality. These are topics that are really close to my heart. So we know that from the dawn of civilization, we've all worked together in families and communities to build nations, empires, to create democracy, to work towards equality, to work out how to live together. And we know this from our daily lives. There's very little that we can do and achieve on our own. But today we're caught in a society that romanticises the individual, that teaches us that we're all in competition, and a life that is highly individualistic. Today I want to talk about that tension, the tension between the individualistic society that we live in and our desire to work collaboratively and with community. The tension between knowing we must be stronger together, but the challenges we face in being strong, with all the attacks we face on our ability to act collectively and cooperatively. I have lived that story. Indeed, I would say that my life's work, which was very generously described by Tim, has been about this question of asking and investigating what will it take for us to be stronger together. And I'm going to focus today's talk mainly on sharing stories from my own experience in researching and practicing coalition building, in the hope that some of these lessons may be useful and of interest to your work here in Western Australia. So I thought I'd give you some context, give you some context about why I became interested in coalitions. I came from a middle-class family, but was highly influenced by my grandmother, who had grown up quite poor and in quite a struggling condition in northern England. And she was a really important figure in my life. She was a stand-in babysitter and all-round carer. And she would tell me stories of her childhood that really were formative of my own political development. And her most important stories were of what it was like to grow up poor and to marry into a middle-class family who didn't really appreciate or like people from the wrong side of the tracks. And my grandma, according to them, was from the wrong side of the tracks. And she made a decision after World War II that she was going to move her family of four, including my father, who was only 4 years old at the time, that they were going to go to another country. And in particular, they wanted to go far away from England and far away from the class system that she saw there. And they wanted to go to a place called Australia because she'd heard that Australia was an egalitarian country. And so when I was little, I grew up knowing what egalitarian meant, because my grandma, from about age 5 or 6, that's what my grandma used to describe this country was meant to be about. Yet as I grew up and became more aware of the world, I started to realise that what her hope for the country was a hope rather than a reality, that Australia wasn't the equal, fair place that she hoped it could have been. And a lot of my desire and energy to get involved in social justice work was about reconciling and trying to make right her and my desire for an equal Australia and the fact that it wasn't equal. So when I got to university, that was where I first got involved in political activity. And I threw myself to be involved in the student movement. And after being involved in the student movement, I got involved in the union movement. And I didn't have the usual route into the union movement. I was hired by the equivalent of Unions WA, by Unions New South Wales, to be their community campaigner. I came in because I had social movement experience, by then both in the student movement and the refugee movement. And I was interested in working for unions because I saw that they were massive organisations, and throughout Australian history, when unions had campaigned for issues of social justice, whether it was for Medicare or superannuation, for against the Vietnam War, when unions had been part of leading those campaigns, then we had better outcomes. We had stronger outcomes. We had a stronger democracy. And I thought if I wanted to achieve a greater sense of justice and equality, then unions could be the place that I could go and try and make that happen. Within about 5 minutes of starting at Unions New South Wales, I became involved in a really big coalition. Who here remembers the war in Iraq? Some of you are too young. Some of you, did people here march against the war? Yeah, same, right? So I was like you back in Sydney, and I was desperately worried about the war in Iraq. As it turned out, we were right to be worried about the war in Iraq, and became involved in helping to set up an organisation called the Walk Against the War Coalition. And in theory, if successful coalitions can be marked by their ability to create massive events, the war in Iraq, the Walk Against the War Coalition should be the most successful coalition in Australian history, because in Sydney, by chance, mainly because of our population size, we had held the largest rally in Australia's history. 500,000 people clogged the streets. It was remarkable. Yet the coalition was highly, highly dysfunctional. We had 90 organisations. We met every Monday night to plan events. And frankly, the only thing that we could agree on was that we should just keep having more rallies. So we had our big rallies, and then we had medium-sized rallies, and then we had small rallies, and then the coalition tore itself apart. So it was this terrible moment for someone like me who had thought, oh, we should all work together collaboratively, coalition building, justice, equality. We'll do it through coalitions, to then find that this coalition, which was so magnificently diverse, was completely dysfunctional. And partly the reason is because people didn't trust each other. It was so diverse that people couldn't even trust each other to formulate a strategy. Luckily, thank goodness, at the same time, is anyone here a teacher or connected to teaching? Right. So about the same time, I came across another coalition called the Public Education Alliance, and they were working in Sydney on a campaign to reduce class sizes, and they were working parents and teachers and principals. And they were running an event just before the state election, and it was a very different coalition. They only had 6 organisations, just those 3 constituencies. Yet the coalition they had built had lasted for 2 years, was incredibly effective, and within a couple of weeks of that event, they won a $250 million policy win, reducing class sizes. And I started to realise that coalitions could be powerful, but they could only be powerful under certain circumstances. That there were some ingredients that were present in the Public Education Coalition that were missing in the Walk Against the War Coalition. And if only I could find what those missing ingredients were, then maybe we would have a better understanding of knowing what it would take to be powerful in working in coalition. So, that's what I did. I spent 3 years doing a PhD and writing this book. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But in a sense, where I got to at that point was it raised 2 questions. This first question was, what does it take to build a powerful coalition? And I didn't mean just powerful coalition as in one was the one that can win? I'm going to breach your thing. It meant that it was having a coalition that could win, but it was more than that. It was more than just being able to win a social change victory occasionally along the way. Powerful also meant the ability to win on a wide spectrum of issues. It's no good being able to win on public education if we can't fix our healthcare system, or winning on wages if we can't have a good house or transport system. That we actually have to have the ability to win on a multiplicity of issues if we want to have a decent civil society, if we want to have coalitions that can struggle for and achieve equality. It also was about being able to create the kind of coalition that was not just about being able to fight on issues, but that could strengthen the organisations who were part of the coalition too. We needed a coalition that was capable of making our organisations stronger, not weaker in the process. But there was an equally important second question that I felt that needed to be answered while I was embarking on this research. And that was, okay, I might be satisfied that we need to work in coalition, but why objectively would we work in coalition today? what is the broader reason for this strategy of coalition building to be effective and useful? And the answer relates to the challenges that citizens and citizen organisations are facing at the moment. Firstly, it's about the issues we face. You know what these are. We face them every day. It's whether you're stressed about climate change or privatisation or threats to the social wage like Medicare or childcare, or the systematic underfunding of community services, or the fact that housing is too expensive, or that aged care is unregulated, or that there's a lack of public transport. We have a multiplicity of issues that no one organisation can fix on their own, that we need to be able to collaborate and work together to be able to address some of those issues. But there's a second set of reasons as to why we would want to work in coalition, and that is about the decline in power of civil society. Whether we look at unions and note that they've declined, their membership base has declined from 50% of the workforce to 15% of the workforce between the 1980s and today, or church attendance, which has declined from 50% attendance in the 1950s to 19% in 2012, and probably a lot lower after the next census. Or we know that, or the decline in the power of community organisations, where many of them have been forced to shift from an advocacy focus to a service delivery focus. We know that many of the sources of our political power and voice have been muted and affected. And that's the second reason why we might want to work in coalition, is to strengthen our voice by bringing our numbers together across different constituencies. Indeed, the problems that we're facing in terms of issues and in terms of our decline in membership speak to a systemic change in the way in which public power is exercised. So there's a theory on public power that I think is helpful. It's a bit simplistic, but it's helpful. By this guy Polanyi, who is a German sociologist who wrote a bunch of books about the rise and fall of social democracy, actually, in both the UK and Germany, including one called The Great Transformations. And in it, he was trying to explain how political power changes over time. And to do it, he tried to identify different sectors of public life. And he, recognising the simplicity of it, drew out three. He said that there were three sectors. There's the market, that is business. There's government, that is politicians and political life. And there's the community or civil society. Now, obviously, everyone participates in all of them. I have a job with an employer, I vote for politicians, and I'm a member of my church, say, But he said that there's power in actually drawing out the distinctions between them, because each of them has different purposes and values. He said that if all three sectors, market, government and civil society, were of the same size and same capacity, then we'd have a highly functional democracy. Because when any one of them were stepped out of line, the other one would hold it to account, right? So the market gets out of line, the community has the power to hold it to account. Same with the government, with market and community. They all can, and he said that anyone can get out of power, including the community, and there's a need for everyone to civilise each other. That would be great if only our public life looked like this. I would suggest it looks a little bit more like this. Yeah, would you agree? A slightly obese market. So out of control that it had a financial crisis that then saw itself get bailouts rather than be held to account. Yeah, that is able to pull back super mining profits taxes and carbon taxes with a single, outraged press release. Right? We have a policy list that sort of substantiates this imbalance of public relationships. And this is where individualism comes from. I talked about the tensions between our individualistic society and the difficulty of achieving collaboration. It comes from this imbalance in our relationships, where the values of the market, the values of competition and individualism, reign supreme over community and civil society. It makes collaboration much harder. It also helps to show that there is a connection between public education issues and wages issues and climate change issues, because they all are coming up because of this same power problem. We don't have a citizen solution to climate change because of this. We don't have a citizen solution for housing because of this. We don't have a citizen solution for wage justice because of this. There's a fundamental power imbalance that's causing our issues to emerge. They might look different, these different issues, but the source of the problem for these issues is the same. So my conclusion around why we build coalitions was we needed to build coalitions because we need to change this. And coalitions built right, not just any old coalition, not like the Walk Against the War coalition, but coalitions built right could potentially start to rebuild the power of community and reset the power of the market. So, back to the story. So in order to investigate what it took to make coalitions work, I went out and did this research. And I took a break from my union organising. I went to the United States and to Canada, and I researched some case studies. I researched one case study based here as well, and had a great time. You know, it was very enjoyable being overseas, finding out more about coalitions. But the summary of what I learnt was that I've developed 5 principles of powerful coalitions. And let me just briefly run you through them, very briefly, The first is less is more, and they're often counterintuitive. The first is less is more. We often think that bigger is better. The Walk Against the War coalition showed that that wasn't the case. What I found was sometimes highly strategic, coupled organisations, a tightly drawn group of organisations can release power and higher commitments than just having a long list of random groups. Who here's heard of AstroTurf? Right? So it's different grassroots, right? It's where you have a fake grass coalition. And you just assemble the biggest list of organisations you can, and then you send out a media release saying, we're so powerful, we've got 50 organisations on board. But your ability to do anything with those organisations is very limited. Anyone familiar to anyone? I used to do it. You know, I used to do it when I was working in the union movement. And the trouble is that it's about as beautiful as AstroTurf is, right? It doesn't really last, gets mouldy. You know, the metaphor, I could stretch the metaphor more, but I won't. The second one is that individuals matter. So coalitions feel like they're about organisations, but it's not just about organisations. It's who in the organisation gets active matters. It matters that leaders are involved. It also matters that champions inside the organisations are present. The more people involved in the coalition, the more successful they are likely to be. The third is to wield self-interest with a sort of justice, which is basically to say you've got to have skin in the game for an organisation. You can't just be acting on stuff that's completely outside of your interests. Organisations have to have skin in the game. Coalitions that are powerful aren't about everyone singing Kumbaya. I mean, they might be if you're into that sort of thing, but they're not. You've got to have skin in the game. But they can't only be about your mercenary self-interest. They also have to be about a sort of justice. It's about holding those two ideas together. Fourth, they have plans. Years of planning. I studied 3 coalitions, each that had 5-year plan, 5 years of organising, and each of them had long-term plans. I was saying to the people at Unions WA, and I'd say it to you, it's like having a plan not for this state election, but all through the next term and for the next state election. That kind of planning is what's required for powerful coalitions to be really effective. And then multi-scaled coalitions, which basically means coalitions that operate at various levels. And it means that it's important for coalitions to not just involve a few heads of staff or people in offices, but members of organisations as well. I'm going to move a bit, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move quickly through a few slides. I also developed a piece about coalition success, which in summary was about saying, I hope this is okay, you need to win stuff, but that's not enough. You also need to shift the political climate if you're going to make change, right? That means changing the environment in which we campaign in the future. But that's not even enough either. We also need to create organisational strength. The organisations who are involved in the coalitions that we build need to be stronger for participating in those coalitions. And we can measure that strength in 2 ways. One, by whether all the organisations still like each other at the end or whether they don't. Walk Against the War Coalition got a big cross on that one. And leadership development. How are we strengthening the capacity of those involved in the coalition, from staff to volunteers to rank and file? So when I was in the US, I also talked to lots of people who were separate to the coalitions I was studying to try and find strategies for organising. And I came across this group called the Industrial Areas Foundation. It's they need some branding help, I think. It's the worst name in the world. But what it basically means, they're the people, I won't go into it, they're the people who set up community organising for the, in 1940 and have helped spread community organising to numerous countries. And I did training with that organisation. And when I did the training, it was like this eureka moment. It was like the light bulb went on. And what I saw them articulating in their training was a whole bunch of themes that some of which resonated with my research. It was like, oh, these people are training what I've been uncovering. Some of which I'd not heard before, which just seemed to be missing elements to what I thought was needed for coalition building. And when after that experience, I decided that Australia needed this, that Australia needed to be able to think and practice. We needed to adapt it. We needed to recognise that we were a different country with a different political environment, but we needed to be able to adapt what was useful in community organising to an Australian context. And what I mean by community organising is I mean some principles like these, that you need to build relationships before you work on issues. I hadn't done that before. I'd been so busy roping people into my latest campaign, I hadn't sat down and just done relationship building with different organisations. I'd focused so much on getting people to take action that I hadn't done the relationship building. This great one, which is you need to build power before you can use it. I was running campaigns on empty. I hadn't gone out and cultivated the whole network of relationships that I needed really to be able to build substantial power. I was just constantly pulling people into campaigns whenever I could find them. And this other one, which is that leaders are made, not born. So how are we making our leaders better? How are we not just, why are we assuming people are going to come along ready built to run campaigns? How are we training people along the way? So I took those lessons and I decided that we needed to bring Alinsky-style community organising. That's the guy who wrote this book, Rules for Radicals. We needed to bring this style of community organising to Australia. So we did. So I started in 2007 and it was a good time to start. If any of you were involved in the union movement, you might remember the Your Rights at Work campaign. Well, the Your Rights at Work campaign was well underway by that stage. Indeed, it was in its final stages. And in Sydney, it was a great time to be able to talk to unions about building more permanent relationships with community organisations because they'd already been doing that to significant success in the Your Rights at Work campaign. For struggling community, do people remember the Cronulla Riots? I know it didn't happen here, but it was pretty awful for all of us. That's a picture. When we talked to the Arab and Muslim communities in Sydney, they were very interested in working out how they could connect in with other organisations to not feel so isolated and peripheral. They wanted to be connected across the community. For the Uniting Church, they just had a new mission statement and a new moderator. They were meant to be walking with God, transforming communities, and they weren't sure how to make it into practice. We walked into the door with this idea of the Sydney Alliance, and they went, that's how we're going to carry out our mission. And the Catholic Church, do people remember World Youth Day in Sydney? Yeah, so that happened, and they didn't have a plan for what to do after it. And so, again, the Sydney Alliance, the proposition of the Sydney Alliance was well timed. So it was this great confluence of timing, a great moment to be able to have these conversations. And so we built the Alliance in that context. We focused on one-to-one meetings. In 6 months, myself and a colleague working 2 days a week, we had 94 one-to-one meetings, and by the end of 2007, we had 13 organisations make a commitment of $130,000 to build the Alliance for a year. We then, over the next year, we did some training in community organising, did more relationship building, and we had 22 organisations commit $1 million for a 3-year organising drive. And then over the next 3 years, we organised, and I'm going to explain a little bit how we did it. And then we founded the Alliance in 2011, September 2011, in Sydney Town Hall with overflowing hall of over 2,000 people. So the Sydney Alliance is not your typical alliance. It's not a bunch of lefty groups. It's intentionally diverse. We bring people together who haven't worked together, and we actually bring people together who haven't liked each other in the past. But we bring them together because they're powerful and because they help us stand for the whole of Sydney. That's our objective. The Sydney Alliance seeks to stand for the whole of Sydney. So if you represent a distinctive constituency, we want you to be part of the Alliance. Doesn't matter your political stripes. So for instance, there's the CFMEU, the Construction Workers, and the Cancer Council. It's an unusual combination. The Jewish Board of Deputies and Western Sydney Community Forum, the Arab Council and the Nurses Association. These are unusual combinations of organisations. And so there's 45 partner organisations. So how do we make it work? Well, the first is knowing the rule of less is more. If you're going to do more, you've got to do it slow. And so we did. We did it really slow. We took 4 years to build the Alliance, and there was very little issue-based campaigning at that time. It was really intensely focused on relationship building and training in the skills of community organising. We built a culture of relational organising, of one-to-one meetings, where the focus was not on what are you working on, but rather who you are as a public person. We did lots of training. We've trained in all levels, from positional leaders to volunteers in organisations. We've trained 3,000 people at our 2-day training and 500 people at the 6-day training. So lots and lots and lots of people, all of which have been handpicked by their organisation to come along. We built core teams inside of organisations, where small teams of people who are willing to carry on the work of the Alliance. And we had to set our own rules. We had to negotiate some of the tricky issues and develop a code of conduct so we could actually work out how we were going to handle it when people disagreed, and how we were going to handle when people stepped over the mark with each other. Those things were negotiated in the lead up. I'll just tell you one campaign. This is my favourite campaign because it's set in a suburb called Glebe, which is in the inner city of Sydney, and I live in Glebe, so I was very proud of this campaign. So we decided at our big listing campaign, when we first worked out what issues we were going to work on, one of them was called social inclusion, and it was incredibly vague. So we had to go out and do a whole bunch of research action meetings with experts to say, if you were going to act on social inclusion, what would you do? What are solutions to create social inclusion for disadvantaged communities? And one of the experts we met with said, well, the way to create social inclusion is to get people a job. Right, so, that's pretty straightforward. Well, not necessarily completely straightforward, but that sounds like a concrete thing we could do. And so we knew we were working on this issue in the inner west of Sydney, and we were looking around for a practical solution. We saw that this was happening. This is called the Herald Park development. Now, it's all developed now, but 4 years ago, when we were working on this, it was just being levelled. It was just a newly formed construction site. And Mirvac, who I understand are here as well, a big construction company, were set to build 2,500 apartments. Right next door, Glebe's an interesting suburb. It's got a whole bunch of housing commission, lots of Aboriginal families living in that housing commission, as well as more middle-class families. So right next door to this massive construction site where there'd be thousands of construction workers was a disadvantaged community who could do with a little bit of social inclusion, i.e. jobs. And so we worked on a strategy to get young Indigenous guys jobs at the Herald Park. I'm not going to go into the details of how we did it, but it involved 7 young men from the Glebe Youth Service directly lobbying first the apprenticeship officer and then the CEO of Mirvac to get those jobs. You know, we say don't do for others what they can do for themselves. So we stood with those young men as they lobbied for the jobs that they created for themselves. And then a jobs program began where two young guys got their start as apprentices on the construction side. So that's the sort of there was never going to be a jobs program but for the fact that the Sydney Alliance intervened and created one to try and build social inclusion. That campaign has now spread and it's been developed in Blacktown for another big industrial park that's been set up there. There's other fun campaigns, and I can tell you more about them if you ask me questions, because I'm going to run out of time. But the biggest win that the Sydney Alliance has achieved is the relationships it builds between the organisations, and the transformation of the organisations themselves. If you had seen what the Uniting Church was 6 years before the Sydney Alliance and you saw it now, you wouldn't recognise it. It's now got a common identity and people act together in ways that they haven't before. The unions, for instance, involved in the Alliance are more actively connected to community organisations than they ever have, with substantial relationships across the sector. So just to finish, I guess my key message here is that we're talking about unions in the community and equality. The vehicle of coalitions is really powerful and important. But my message here today is to say that coalitions are good, but some coalitions are more powerful than others. We've gone through some of the lessons more broadly about alliance building and issue-based alliance building, those 5 principles of coalitions, and some of the lessons that I've learnt from building a much more in-depth coalition using community organising with the Sydney Alliance. And I'm looking forward to having a Q&A discussion with you about whether any of these things might be relevant here in Perth. Thanks.